This video is sponsored by Describe. Today we're going to talk about the difference between running a pre-written, published adventure for your game or running an adventure you make up all on your own. For the purposes of clarity, I'm going to refer to pre-written adventures as modules. For those who don't know, that's kind of an old school term because most old adventures were shorter and they were designed so that you could pretty much just take them and drop them into your campaign at your leisure. They were modular, thus the name. We get this a little bit with the anthology books that Wizards of the Coast still publishes, and that's still true for a lot of adventures published by independent creators online, but Wizards of the Coast's larger adventures usually don't work that way anymore. Despite the lip service that you can take these adventures apart and use pieces of them in your game, that's not really what they expect you to do when they create the adventure. Still, purely for the sake of clarity, and possibly to keep that possibility in mind, remember that we can take these apart and use pieces of them, more on that later, I'm going to refer to any pre-published adventure or campaign as a module. Meanwhile, for a campaign that you make up on your own, whether you write it all down before the first session or you're just making up each adventure an hour before the next game, we'll call those Homebrew. And the first point I'm going to make isn't really an argument for running modules, but it is an argument for reading modules. Because reading a module is really useful for new GMs who are trying to figure out how D&D adventures work and what D&D adventures look like. Now, there is a slightly weird aspect to this. A lot of 5th edition adventures are long, sprawling campaigns about stopping a huge evil threat, and that might not be the kind of campaign you want to run. That's why if you do go down this road, I'd encourage you to check out a few different types of adventures just to read to see what you like. One of the starter set modules is great to make sure you can get a sense of how a more contained adventure functions. Then, check out a single level of a dungeon or an adventure from one of those anthology books. And then, if you're up for it, check out one of these sprawling modules. It's still useful to see how they handle some stuff. Do some online Googling, look at some introductory videos, or read some reviews to see which ones you think you might enjoy. For example, if you have no interest in running a mega dungeon, don't waste your time reading the mega dungeon book. But the formatting of these books is still extremely useful to see. Even if you have no desire to one day put your adventure online for others to see and read, it's still useful for you to check out how these adventures work. A lot of them devote a chapter to each specific section, so that way you aren't overwhelmed with information. Some of them have an introductory chapter with the most important characters or a guide for how they think the adventure will flow. I'd argue that these sorts of details are some of the most useful, even if you don't run the adventure, because it tells you how this sort of campaign is structured. Knowing that can help offer some guidance on how a homebrew campaign can be structured and run, even if the style and tone of your campaign is totally different. Now, seeing this formatting and how much information they put into their books is a blade that cuts both ways. You might feel that you need to put as much information into your homebrew adventure as you might find in a module, but remember, that module is being written for thousands of potential game masters. They're trying to answer every possible question that any group in the world might have. A perfect example of this comes in the form of the plot hooks. A module usually offers 2 or 3 plot hooks to help characters get locked in and committed to the campaign. This isn't universal, but in my experience, there's usually one that appeals to altruism. Something is going on, and we need you to figure it out. One that appeals to curiosity. Nobody has seen this sort of magical activity in 1,000 years. And one that appeals to a more mercenary mindset. If you go check this out, I'll give you a whole bunch of gold. You, as the game master, might not need all these plot hooks to get your players invested in your story. But the writers of these modules don't know your players, so they have to cover all of their bases. And situations like this crop up all the time, and if you know what to look for, you can see the moments where they're adding a lot more detail than you might need, because they don't know what information will actually be useful to you. Which brings me to a major misconception that we need to talk about. The idea that modules are easier to run than homebrew. Depending on your style and your strengths and weaknesses as a GM, this might be true, but there's no guarantee of that. Modules just require a different kind of work, but they don't require less work. Let's use a level of a dungeon as an example. To run homebrew, you have to design a dungeon, decide what's in each room, and pick some monsters and some treasure. To run a module, you have to familiarize yourself with a dungeon that you didn't design, take notes on the things that you think are the most important, and be ready to flip around a book while you run the game. To be completely honest, it's possible these will take the exact same amount of time. Or it's possible you're someone who reads really fast and will retain enough information that you can run the dungeon without glancing down at your notes every 3 seconds. You don't need to memorize it, but you just need to be generally aware of the most important parts of the dungeon so that as you're describing each section, you as the game master know what's coming and can answer your players' questions in a way that properly foreshadows the manticore or whatever else is in the dungeon. Or maybe you're someone who can whip up a dungeon map in less than an hour. And honestly, you don't need to draw your own map to make that happen. You can find hundreds of dungeon maps online, and as long as you're willing to take a little time to add details for monsters, traps, treasure, plot clues, and anything else you might want to add, then that's going to serve you just as well as if you ran a dungeon out of the book. So how much mileage you get out of a module depends on your own workflow. Again, let's use that dungeon example. Speaking personally, I can put together a small dungeon pretty quickly. And thanks to the Dungeon 23 trend, which I have been doing in fits and starts, I'll probably post an update about my progress soon, I'm learning a lot more about how to make larger dungeons. But there are cool, inventive things I find in the published dungeons that I like a lot. And then the question becomes, do I want to steal a small detail from my own dungeon? Or do I want to lift an entire dungeon for my game? And if that's the case, what are the plot hooks? Are those useful to me as well? Most of the time, I just make my own maps and adventures and factions, but last year, I just dropped the entire Caves of Chaos module into my game, and I had terrific fun doing so. And I learned a lot that would definitely impact how I ran that module next time. So here's the first big selling point for modules, and honestly, I think it's the most important argument. Modules do a lot of really important work for you. They give you maps and NPCs and flavor text and magic items and side quests and plot hooks and plot twists, and depending on what details you need, there's a huge advantage to that. Again, let's use that Caves of Chaos example. You might not know this, but the Caves of Chaos module has no proper nouns in it. The Goblin and Kobold and Gnoll leaders don't have names. The Orc factions don't have names. The human cultists and whatever they're worshipping have no details around them at all. Gary Gygax specifically wanted game masters to invent their own names and customize the factions and motivations to better suit their needs. And that works fine for me, because I think coming up with names is something that I'm pretty good at. In fact, I sometimes wind up disliking half the names I find in a module anyway. So for me, getting cool NPC names wasn't something that I needed help with. Instead, the module gave me a bunch of different factions in different locations on a pretty cool map. Again, these factions didn't have a lot of details for what they all want, but that's something that I personally can flesh out and add details to as needed. But you might not have those same strengths and weaknesses as a game master that I do, so you might not get the same benefit from a module like that. You might instead really value something more modern, where there is more focus on fleshing out the factions and the NPCs. But whatever it is that you need for your game, there is a module out there that has done that work already. Heck, maybe you just have a hard time coming up with flavor text for your own games, so you just want a module that will offer the descriptions of dungeon rooms or magic items or NPCs, because you have a hard time coming up with those on your own. Of course, if that's all you're looking for, you don't need to buy a 200-page adventure book just to get a few paragraphs of box text. You can instead sign up for Describe, the sponsor of today's video. Describe is a website where a team of professional writers devote their time to coming up with extremely useful descriptive text that you can use for your own games. If you're looking for a cool, evocative way to describe an abandoned elven village, or a frost giant zombie, or a wand of binding, or scenes like a dragon hatching out of an egg, or a column response for an order of paladins about to ride into battle, Describe has everything you might need to add flavor to your game. And they also have a bunch of excellent interactive maps of awesome locations like ruins, dungeons, wilderness, guild halls, all sorts of awesome stuff. And each section of the map has a paragraph of descriptive text assigned to it, so you can just drop in a few monsters that suit the location, and then you're good to go. It's honestly something I'm going to use for my next Homebrew campaign. It makes the game so much easier to run. And the fine folks at Describe have been kind enough to sponsor this video. If you visit describe.com/supergeek and use the code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can get 10% off of your first subscription payment. I have a friend, Artivis Gleam, who normally does these Describe ads for me, but come on, today's video is so perfect for this subject. This ad basically wrote itself. Once again, that's dscryb.com/supergeek. Thank you so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. Now let's talk about a huge weakness modules have. They don't know your characters. Modules are a very strange form of writing because they're essentially adventure stories that have no idea who the main character is going to be. To be honest, the fact that published adventure modules are the main way we interact with the game, and yet they have no main characters included, is the #1 reason Dungeons & Dragons is really hard to adapt to film and television. I don't envy the folks who have to figure out a way to have iconic main characters for an adaptation of a game that specifically has no main characters to adapt. Some modules try to find a way around this, and they take a few different approaches. For example, the first D&D 5th edition starter set, The Lost Mine of Phandelver, comes with character sheets that the players can use, and each character has some specific tie into the story or the region, or just something that is intended to encourage them to get involved in this sort of adventure. Pre-generated characters are a common solution to this problem, but they're not the only approach. Some modules include a custom background that players can take, which will help them create a character who is more deeply connected to the NPCs, the events, or the themes of the adventure. Some modules come as part of a larger campaign setting book, so if players create characters using the resources from the book, then in theory they'll automatically be better suited to the adventure. But that doesn't really resolve the main issue, that the module doesn't know, and cannot know, who your characters are and what they're going to do. A module might make some seriously flawed assumptions about what your players would do, or perhaps even demand behavior from them that doesn't actually line up with how they would rationally behave. When you create Homebrew, you can more carefully make decisions that might line up with what your players enjoy, and doesn't include the stuff that they aren't going to respond well to. Homebrew also gives you the opportunity to tie in the player characters' backstories into the main story. If you're on this channel, there's a good chance you enjoy actual play shows like Critical Role, or Dimension 20, or The Adventure Zone. And one thing that a lot of actual play shows do is structure the core events of the campaign around major events and characters from the players' backstories. We can see this really clearly in my most recent episode of Critical Role Demystified, and then in the first season of The Legend of Vox Machina cartoon, where the Briarwoods, two villains from Percy's backstory, are placed in front of the party and given a lot of plot relevance. I plan to do a whole other video about structuring a campaign around player backstories, but this is something that is so much easier when you're putting together a homebrew campaign. However, it's worth noting that you can change anything you want from a module to make it a better fit for your game. For example, I'm running a Curse of Strahd campaign, and during the prep, one of my players specifically asked that there not be any themes of self-harm. That was part of the Session 0 conversation. If you're familiar with the adventure, there's at least one major plot beat from the story that describes a character committing an act of self-harm. It's a major part of the backstory of the campaign. It's written in a handout that you're expected to show to the players. So I changed that detail slightly to remove the self-harm aspect, and rewrote the handout to match. That's just one change, and it's perhaps the most significant one I made for that game, but it's also extremely easy to do so. And in my opinion, it's kind of essential for you to adjust your module to better suit your group. Obviously, this depends on your group, and if you're running games at conventions or local game stores, or running paid games for strangers online, you might not always be able to make adjustments to match what your players expect. But I've said before that we don't run games purely for our own enjoyment. As game masters, we run the games we think people are going to enjoy. And when we buy a published campaign, we can change anything we want. It's totally fine if it bears little to no comparison to the original product once you're done, because the original product doesn't matter. The final product isn't the module you bought, it's the adventure you run. And you only need to keep the parts of the module that will actually make the game fun or tense or interesting. None of these modules are perfect, and especially none of them will be perfect for you, because they weren't written for you. But thankfully there are a bunch of people online who have run these adventures and can offer advice for how to make them more fun or more tense or more interesting. Some of them sell tie-in products that will enhance the game, but others just put a bunch of advice out there for free. Reddit especially has a huge, robust community of people sharing details that make Curse of Strahd more fun to run. And Curse of Strahd is probably the most beloved 5th edition module, arguably neck and neck with Lost Mine of Phandelver. Now I can speak from experience. If you try to put every piece of advice from that subreddit into your campaign, the adventure will balloon and get really intense and really detailed. But you can absolutely find pages where people can point you toward the best online resources to solve whatever issues you might want to fix in any of these modules. That information gets a little bit more scarce once you leave behind the official Wizards of the Coast 5th edition products, but for third-party adventures, there are still people who can help answer questions and help you adjust your campaign to better suit your players. Of course, whether you're running a module or homebrew game, giving your players an idea of what to expect can help them make a character that is better suited to the game. In either situation, part of your Session 0 should be focused on giving players some sense of what the adventure will look like. This helps them create characters who are actually compatible with the adventure. For example, if a player has a backstory that involves going to find people who can help deal with a supernatural problem plaguing their hometown, then if you're running something like Princes of the Apocalypse, it wouldn't be too challenging to tie that story thread into that module. You just Put the hometown somewhere near the valley, maybe replacing one of the towns in the module or just adding it somewhere else on the map, and you're good to go. Again, it's slightly more complicated than that, but we'll get into how to do this some other time. On the other hand, if you're running Curse of Strahd or Tomb of Annihilation, both modules where the party travels together to a remote destination for the bulk of the adventure, then this backstory would be tougher to reconcile. You could maybe still make it work, but this is why I think it's important to give players a sense of what they can expect from the campaign. You don't want somebody rolling up an urban bounty hunter who is designed to work best for a city campaign, only for them to find out 2 sessions in that most of the adventure will be spent in the wilderness. Again, this is true for both modules and Homebrew. It's just good advice overall. For my Curse of Strahd game, I told the players that because of circumstances in the campaign, a character death would not necessarily mark the end of that character. There were other forces at play that could give them the option to keep playing the same character. On the flip side, if I were to run Tomb of Annihilation, I would ask all of my players to roll up 3 or 4 characters because there is no resurrection in that module for story reasons. This isn't information the player characters would have, but it's vital for the players themselves to know some of these things going into the campaign. There's one more major selling point for modules that I want to touch on. The fact that modules create a shared language for the community. Players and GMs alike can compare stories about when they played through Out of the Abyss or Rime of the Frost Maiden or what have you. I've discussed this before, but I really enjoy the fact that the 5th edition adventures act as a way to introduce the community to some lore from the old school days of the hobby. Although, not all of them are handled well, and that can cause some friction as they adapt older material without the critical eye that they should. Honestly, that's a pretty damning reason not to buy Wizards of the Coast's modules, but there are plenty of other companies producing modules you can drop into your game. And the fact that any of us can find any of these modules and run them, and discuss them in online spaces and compare notes, is really cool. I love how, when you talk about the Uncaged anthology series on the DM's Guild, a lot of people know what you're talking about and have positive things to say. If you aren't familiar with these products, I can tell you that each collection contains adventures inspired by real-world myth and folklore, and each adventure subverts tropes around a female mythological creature or monster, like a hag or a harpies or a Medusa. These sorts of things. They're exactly the kind of thing that we can drop into our game, and the fact that we can all talk about them online and know exactly what we're talking about is one of the coolest parts of the hobby. I personally love when players can compare notes about how they handled an NPC in their campaigns, and find out that someone else in another group never even agreed to work with that character, so they got a completely different experience from the adventure. That sense of community sometimes holds me back and makes me feel like I don't actually want to change too much about a module, because I like it when players can have that experience as part of the community. But ultimately, I think that's something I need to get over, because it's far more important that I run a game I'm confident in and proud of. And yeah, sometimes that means I need to change an NPC's name, because I won't be able to say their name with a straight face. Sometimes it means shuffling monsters around, because I think it makes the locations more interesting. Sometimes it means adding or removing story beats, because what's in the book just isn't going to work for me. I had to change the final boss of Princes of the Apocalypse from a fire elemental to a red dragon because I was running the game for 4 druids, and the original villain wouldn't have been able to handle 4 tidal wave spells in a row. Because what I have to remember is that this is all still part of the community experience. I said it before, once we buy these books, they belong to us, and these modules are not the final product we should concern ourselves with. The final product is the game. And honestly, you don't have to run a module to get use out of it. You can just rip off the contents, steal the stuff you like, and discard the rest. Heck, you can make a totally original homebrew campaign made out of the component pieces of the modules you've read. One of my goals over the next couple of years is to read a lot more modules, because I know there is a ton of cool content out there. Even if I never sit down and run them all, there's stuff I can steal from each one and drop into my game. And for a home game, you don't even need to cite your sources. Nobody expects you to pull back the curtain and say, well, this dungeon is from Tales from the Yawning Portal, this villain is from Red Hand of Doom, and these monsters are from Tome of Beasts 2 and Reddit. If a player wants to be a game master and straight up asks you where all these cool things came from, you can tell them privately. But the reason these modules exist is to make your game better. If you wind up only liking one character, one magic item, and a couple of monsters, then that's all you need to use. Drop that stuff into your homebrew game, and never look back. So, okay, I've given you a lot to think about, and hopefully you can use this information to figure out what approach might work best for your style. But if you're curious where I land on this subject, I have to admit I'm a bit of a strange case. On the one hand, I'm usually able to create a D&D adventure really quickly. 2 of my proudest moments in my game mastering career involve running D&D games with very little prep. I remember once getting to my friend's apartment early, maybe 45 minutes before the game started. God, remember playing D&D in person at other people's homes? Anyway, I didn't have much content prepared, but as soon as I parked, I pulled out a piece of graph paper and started sketching a dungeon. This is what I came up with. It's not a wildly complex dungeon, but it had enough branching choices and intrigue to fill an hour or two of gameplay. And at the bottom level was a portal that led to another realm, where they could meet and interact with the main villains of the campaign for the first time. The second time came in my Princess of the Apocalypse game, when the party traveled to a location somewhere along the edge of the map, and I couldn't really remember what was in that region, so I used the name on the map and made up some content on the fly that filled several sessions, and my characters were energized and excited and engaged. It was awesome. In fact, that happened 3 different times in that campaign. They kept going to these cool-sounding side locations that I didn't have much prepared for, because I had no recollection of that section of the book. In fact, I'm not even sure I'd read that section of the book. But that leads to the other reason I don't tend to steal from modules very often, or even run them as full campaigns, at least not very often. Because personally, I have a really hard time reading modules. I'm an experiential learner. I learn by doing. So it's actually really difficult for me to sit down and read an RPG book and imagine how I might someday maybe run it. I need to go into the book with a really clear goal. Maybe I know the players I want to run this game for, and I can start imagining how they will interact with different aspects of the adventure. Or maybe I have something specific I'm looking for that I can steal from my own game, so I'm just trying to lift the stuff that I think is cool. Or maybe I want to convert it to a different campaign setting, or even a different game system. Regardless, I'm not really able to just sit down and read a module recreationally. I need to go into it with a goal, because then I'm actually engaging with the text in a meaningful way. When I ran a game for some family members during the lockdown, one of my goals was to read a bunch of smaller modules and scatter them across the map, so that way it would be less work to build a full campaign. This is the approach Matt Colville has discussed several times on his channel. It's how he runs a lot of his games. But that approach really works best when you've already read a bunch of stuff. Sure, you might need to reread it to refresh your memory and have a copy at the ready during the session, but in theory you're drawing on a well of knowledge you already have to figure out which modules would be a good fit, and that reduces your prep time for the game. But because I didn't have that same level of knowledge, I was having to track down short modules that might be around the same level for the party, and then once I found one I had to read it through and figure out which aspects would work for the game and which had to be discarded. And a lot of this content was from older editions, which adds a whole other challenging aspect as I then had to decipher these adventures and figure out how to make them work for 5th edition, and then my eyes would just wind up sliding off the page. So it was faster, in that case, to just make adventures I thought were cool. But when you're making a bunch of small adventures, that still takes time, and you can find yourself burning out pretty quickly. I would run out of ideas, and the concept of going to find modules I could maybe steal from and find inspiration wasn't as easy or fun as I wanted it to be, because I was under pressure to find content for the next game. Of course, it was 2020, there were maybe some other reasons I got burnt out more quickly than usual, but still, as long as I could find some sort of prompt or inspiration, I was able to come up with some content for an adventure fairly easily. Until I wasn't able to do that anymore, and I just needed a break. Here are the modules I've actually read. Everything else I flashed on screen during this video is something that I own in one form or another, but I haven't read all the way through. I've picked through a few modules and stolen monsters, but in one example, I started reading Ghosts of Saltmarsh with the intention of stealing something for my campaign. I didn't know what I was going to steal, but I wanted to run an adventure with some Sahuagin in it. But as I started reading, I realized I wanted to run Ghosts of Saltmarsh as a campaign. That doesn't mean it'll stay exactly as it is in the book, but I liked the factions and the characters in the opening chapter, and I knew my group would probably enjoy them as well. So this is one of the reasons why I've said that I have a goal to read more modules this year. I have a bunch of them. I've spent money on them or put them on my wish list because I am excited to read them and run them. But because of how I usually interact with the text, I have a hard time doing just that. But I also want to run more games of D&D this year. Maybe even as a paid DM. So if I do go into these modules with that goal, then perhaps that will unlock the part of my brain that has a hard time with these sorts of books. Thank you so much for watching. This is another topic that we could have kept talking about for a lot longer, so let me know what else you might like to hear me discuss on this subject. Another question I get a lot in the comments on this channel is, how do you run a published module? I think I know what people mean when they ask about that, and I believe I have some advice on that subject, but I didn't have room for that in this video. But if that's something you'd like to see me talking about, and if there's some specific aspect of running modules that would be useful to get advice about, let me know in the comments below. If you want to support this channel, there are a few ways you can do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out. I have new videos dropping every Monday and Thursday. The sooner you watch a new video, especially a non-Critical Role video, the better it performs and the more that helps the channel. If you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon. Every new patron I get at any dollar amount really makes a difference and gets me closer to unlocking some of my goals to improve this channel. If you can't support me financially, I totally get it. You can still participate in the community by joining my Discord channel and hang out with other people who just love RPGs and want to help each other have better games. And you can also stay up to date with my latest news by signing up for my newsletter. If you want to know a little bit more about how to steal ideas from not just modules, but books, TV, film, podcast, comics, whatever, then check out this video about how to steal. For your RPG games, I mean. Until next time, play fair and have fun.